Video games have grown up a lot over the last decade, but there are still some elements that haven't changed with the times. Let me know what you think down below, but first, my opinion. I'm Tarmack, and this is Feature Creep. Vestigial gameplay. I didn't coin that word combination, but it rather aptly summarizes the topic today. Vestigial as a term refers generally to the body in an evolutionary sense and is used to describe aspects of the human form that once had a use, such as the remnants of a tail, but are no longer of value. Or a neat example I saw on Wikipedia about goosebumps being a holdover from when it would help to puff up the hair on our evolutionary ancestors to make them look bigger and more threatening. A crude example, perhaps, but the game industry is of course not immune to the idea of "we've always done it this way," which, by the way, is the single most hated phrase in the English language by yours truly. And I thought it might be valuable to talk about gameplay mechanics and video game concepts that used to have a real use, but now do not. To ease into it, I'll start with the idea of cheat codes. For those that don't know, cheat codes weren't put into games for the player. They're quality assurance tools used by the game devs to test the game. Level skips, God mode, etc. all serve the purpose of letting a dev make it to specific areas of a game much more quickly than a standard playthrough, but without, in theory, breaking the game to do it. Cheats offer players a way of playing the game on their own terms, which is a great aspect. I'm not fond of cheats being charged for, but this isn't an industry complaint video, so I'll leave the point at that, the idea that the industry has found a way to repurpose something that originally had a very different purpose from the use that gamers attribute to it. The next bit that I find extremely interesting and have pondered doing a whole video on at some point is that of video game interfacing. The mouse and keyboard combination hasn't materially changed in decades. They've gotten more precise, added more buttons, removed chords, but at the end of the day, isn't it bizarre that a two-device setup involving the WASD death grip has held on for so long? The same is true of consoles in my view as well. The controllers are very iterative, adding everything from more buttons to analog functionality and that kind of stuff, but in fact, the old Atari joysticks actually have a reasonable amount in common with the current day controllers. Throughout game history, there aren't really many outliers to the above realm of control simplicity that had any modicum of success. The rollerball in arcades was one example, palm-pinching as it may have been. The Wii and Wii U were obviously unique as well. The most exciting development, though, is in the VR space with the individual hand controllers that can go as far as to be aware of hand gestures like pointing or thumbs up. The problem with these control schemes, and what worries me about them, is that oddly enough, the same reason that lateral raises in the gym require much lighter weight than other exercises. It's also the same reason that I don't believe we'll ever control computers in a way similar to the Minority Report. It's frankly difficult to do an activity for an extended period of time without having something to rest your arms on. That reliance on controllers led to one of the more major changes in FPS games, which is the idea of having fewer weapons. Essentially because of the lack of buttons, switching from one weapon through the other 12 that you have is a pain on the consoles. Thus why so many FPS games reduce the weapon carry count. As controllers become more complex in design, that requirement goes away. But in the vein of vestigial gameplay mechanics, do you think we'll ever go back to Half-Life levels of weapons in FPS games? I'm not so sure. Another element of unnecessary gameplay is that of repeating an action X number of times, usually 3 in order to kill a boss creature or get past a puzzle. Think Mario 64 for a moment, grabbing a hold of Bowser's tail and spinning him off a platform. Or even something as recent as Bloodborne with Rom the vacuous spider that surrounds itself with smaller spiders 3 times before you can kill it. From Software has a pretty stellar reputation for going against the grain, but even then it can creep in. Going back a bit in game design, and in plenty of places outside of game design, you'll find references to the rule of 3. This is the idea that psychologically the human condition prefers things in threes. They're more satisfying and more memorable. It's the same reason that radio advertisements usually mention the name of the business or product 3 times, because that's how they maximize the memory retention of the listener. You'll see it everywhere back in the day. 3 lives, 3 continues, even now it lingers, thus why games are generally treated like movies for the purpose of trilogies. And unfortunately, that also hampers game design. Any artificial construct that you choose to adhere to limits the choices going further. How much emergent gameplay is available if you've locked yourself into a 3 repeated action critical path to success? In the case of Mario 64, they used the same boss mechanic more than once, just adding little adjustments to the area in which it occurs. For an otherwise amazing game, that was in my view a poor design choice. The rule of 3 isn't as pervasive as it used to be, but if you pay attention while playing, you'll see it. I don't think that devs, generally speaking, make an active choice based on the rule of 3. I think they just naturally default to it because it's psychologically comfortable. It actually is something that they should try to actively be aware of and consider whether defaulting to the rule of 3 is holding their gameplay back. Another that I would like to see some revision in is the concept of turn-based combat. Traditionally, game hardware, of course, acted in a linear way, with one action occurring after another. So turn-based combat was a real thing that was required. Most JRPGs, lots of RTS games and all, they had a system where one player makes an action, that action then completes as though every other individual on the board was sitting around doing nothing, and then it was the next player's turn. What I haven't seen, and it could well be out there but I've just missed it, is a concurrent turn-based system. Everyone involved makes decisions based on the information they have at the end of the previous turn. They queue up their actions, trying to predict what actions will be completed by the other players during the same turn. And when everyone has made their choices, the turn executes, and all of these actions occur simultaneously, allowing for more emergent gameplay than would otherwise exist. We haven't needed completely linear turn-based gameplay for a long time as far as the hardware is concerned, and I think it would be interesting to see some of that change. It seems to me that it's worth being aware of not just what aspects of game design the developers are using, but interesting to consider why they are using them. In a lot of cases, a particular design choice may rather be a passive decision, because that's how they did it on their last game, for example. And their last game may have had a very good reason, but the current one doesn't necessarily have that. I'm actually very curious to see the VR scene about a year or so after they launch. The reason why is that because unlike essentially any other change in the game industry, VR requires a completely different design mentality. Different as in the difference between, arcades and home gaming, or the difference between retail design and free-to-play. Every design decision will be scrutinized by the devs because this is a totally new space, and I wonder how the new and creative design ideas that will flow from VR will affect the rest of the industry, regardless of the overall mass market success of VR itself. I admit to being a bit complainy lately, which isn't my intent. I'm definitely game to tear a strip off companies that do terrible things, but it's a bit too easy to slide into that role by default because a cynical worldview is very comfortable as a place for me, unfortunately. I am making an active effort to not do that, which is part of why this episode is designed as it is. So, let's talk about vestigial gameplay, things in game design that maybe used to have a real purpose, but now are just being included because they've always been included, to the detriment of gaming in general. Feature Creep is a regular show every week, so if this is your first time on the channel, there's well over 100 of these videos to check out. Hopefully you find some content here that you enjoy and choose to subscribe and stick around. Thanks for watching. That's all I have to say. Tarmack out.